Hello, beautiful visionaries. This is Lorna Liana, and welcome to the Modern Shaman Mystery School, an online event that is a hybrid psychedelics and plant medicine conference with School of Practical Shamanism. We are going to explore how we can apply ancient shamanic wisdom to our complex modern lives, transform into the highest version of ourselves, and become the visionary leaders the world so urgently needs. In this week-long introduction to the world of shamanism, we will explore how to work with different sacred plant medicines as well as certain psychedelics. We're also going to explore the wisdom of indigenous culture and discover the tools of dream work and accessing expanded states of consciousness. We will also dive into the intriguing world of mediumship and working with your spirit guides. So today, I'm so happy to bring to you Kyle Buller, who is a student, teacher, breathwork facilitator, healer, and podcast host. He is the co-founder of Psychedelics Today. Kyle specializes in breathwork, spiritual emergence, and psychedelic integration. He will share with us how accessing non-ordinary states of mind can catalyze healing and spiritual growth, what Western psychedelic psychotherapy looks like, and the importance of protecting cognitive liberty today. Thank you so much for joining us, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I would love to hear your story on what got you interested in healing, cognitive liberty, and non-ordinary states of consciousness so that you would pursue a vocation focused on these intriguing topics.
Sure, yeah. So my story, I guess, kind of begins, well, I guess I've always kind of been into states of consciousness ever since I was a kid, but I think I forgot about it. And then when I was 16, I had a pretty traumatic snowboarding accident. And make the story short, I could make it very long, but I know we don't have that much time. I ended up rupturing my spleen. I hit this mound of snow. It was in a blind spot, and I couldn't turn. Time slowed down, and I had like a million thoughts racing through my head. It's like, if I hit this, I'm going to die. I need to turn. I need to do so many things. And by the time I got to the hospital, my veins in my upper body collapsed. I had no pulse, and I started having like an outer body experience. And it's always kind of hard to put into words. You know, these experiences are really ineffable. But I was like in my body and I was out of my body at the same time. I had this like empathic feeling where I could feel all the nurses and doctors' emotions. And it wasn't until like they put me into the CAT scan machine to figure out where I had internal bleeding, this voice came over me, and I kept hearing the doctor say, "Don't fall asleep, Kyle, don't fall asleep." And I was just so cold and in so much pain. But this voice came over me, and it just said, "Don't worry, relax into it. Everything's going to be fine." And then I just heard, "Everything's going to be okay. You're going back to the stars where we all come from." And at that moment, I just kind of started sinking into that, and it ended up being like a very blissful, loving experience. And I had like this kind of excitement of like, I'm going home, I'm going back to the stars. And then I woke up in an ICU unit, intensive care.
Oh no, was that a buzzkill moment? You're like,
Yeah,
I thought I was going to be the
just,
stars.
I was just like, where the hell am I? And so, I mean, that really stuck with me. Like, I didn't have this traditional near-death experience where you see a tunnel of light, you go down this tunnel, you see these beings. It was more of this, like, felt experience, and I heard this voice that said, "You're going home." And it was just so profound. When I woke up, it was like I couldn't remember it. And so it left me with a lot of confusion of what just happened to me, where did I go? Because I felt like I went somewhere and I talked to something. And I had no framework to work with. So, I mean, after that experience, I was obviously in a blissful state for about a few months. And then reality started sinking in, and I was like, oh my God, what is this world? And fell into a pretty heavy depression and existential crisis because I really didn't know how to make sense of it. And I guess I didn't have that visual experience to connect it to, where maybe some people do. It was just this felt experience. Like, I knew, but I just couldn't. There was like an amnesia there. I couldn't remember it. So, you know, I was just trying to, I was 16 at this time, so normal kids are worrying about other things, and I'm I'm trying to put my life back together and figure out these big questions of life and death. So I went through this pretty heavy, kind of like a suicidal depression for a couple of years, because that blissful experience that I felt during that felt like home. This reality felt kind of like hellish, with all the suffering and just all the social structures we put up and that continue our suffering. I just couldn't wrap my mind around it. And so that kind of launched me into exploring the mind, consciousness, and this thing that we call life. And then I started getting into more of the psychedelic stuff a few years after that, which then catapulted me more into this realm.
Did that, so when you started to step onto a more, to embark on your psychedelic exploration, did you find that some of those expanded states of consciousness that you were able to visit through the use of entheogens, did that remind you of that home feeling?
Well, I never had any experience with substances, really. I might have had like cannabis a few times here and there. And I was just in this this pretty depressed state of mind, and a friend of mine was like, hey, do you want to eat some mushrooms? And for me it was more like, okay, I'm gonna eat these and escape because I don't really care about anything. I went out into the woods, and I didn't know anything really about mushrooms. I had that, what is that, stereotype of people eat them and see funny things. I mean, that was about it. I had friends that used them here and there, but I didn't really research them or know too much about them. But in that experience, I started to leave my body again, and I found this little rock on this narrow trail, and I said, this, I need to sit down. This is where I need to die. I just watched my friend puke his up, so I'm like, oh my God, we're overdosing or something like that. But the feeling came back, and I was like, oh my God, this is so familiar. I know this feeling. This is death creeping in. And then all of a sudden the world had teeth and mouths. And the world just ate me and tore me to pieces, which I didn't know is a pretty shamanic initiation type of experience where, you get eaten and torn apart by spirits or whatever, or nature. And I ended up in this, I guess it was a void. I, didn't know anything about myself. I didn't know my name. I didn't know where I was, what time it was. I didn't know anything about myself. So definitely a lot of ego dissolution there. But there was this sense of, I've been here before. This reminds me so much of that experience of dying. And all of a sudden these kind of entities came out and said, yeah, you have thousands of times. And I was just like, oh my God, this must be some sort of death bardo. I was like, is this where I went when I died that one night? And they're like, yeah, more or less so. And I kept asking them questions, and it was this very trickster archetype, I view it now. But that experience really helped me to, I guess, contextualize my near-death experience, because it reminded me so much of what that was. And it helped put peace to, I guess, some of those questions that were left unanswered of where did I go? What did I talk to? Did I talk to God, or did I talk to a higher power? It was boom, right there in front of my face. So it really helped me kind of process a lot of that stuff. And I didn't know anything about Terence McKenna or Rick Strassman at the time. So this whole idea of self-transforming machine elves, I was just other people have seen these things too. It totally just blew my mind away. But then I stumbled across Rick Strassman's work, and I believe in the beginning of his book DMT, the Spirit Molecule, the reason why that caught my attention, because it had near-death experience in the title, and I was just wanted to learn more about it. And I believe he stated sometimes when people are kind of at that stage of death in a near-death experience, and they're given anesthetics, it can suppress some of the visual hallucinations. And so that just made so much sense to me after I read that. It's well, maybe that's what happened. Maybe I had this endogenous release of DMT. It's kind of stopped this visual hallucination thing. But then the more I started researching psilocybin, I was like, oh my God, this is kind of like an oral active dose of DMT. I started putting some pieces together, and it just kind of it made me think there's got to be a connection there, because it felt so familiar of what it was like to actually die.
So let's fast forward into the world of psychedelic psychotherapy. So you're intrigued by non-ordinary states of consciousness, and then at a certain point, you decided to go further and study non-ordinary states and actually explore a vocation as a integration specialist and a breathwork specialist. And so what made you decide, hey, I want to bring this experience to more people, or work with people on how to integrate these experiences, especially since experiences of spiritual emergence can be triggered by entheogens, and can be very difficult for people to come to terms with.
Yeah, and that's the spiritual emergence thing is really important. But how I got there, so after that experience, I realized this is what I want to do. I really want to study this stuff. So I came across Rick Strassman's work, some Terence McKenna work, but it wasn't until I came across the work of Stan Grof, who's a Czechoslovakian-American psychiatrist who actually did a lot of LSD research in Prague, Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic back then. And he's done some research in the States here before it became illegal. And so I found this odd little school in Vermont that had a transpersonal psychology program. And I knew I wanted to study transpersonal psychology because it kept coming up in these psychedelic books in the literature. And so I attended that, and really it was a kind of a cool school because I got to do independent studies. I came across breath work there, and I just was able to create all these independent studies kind of researching psychedelic psychotherapy. So it was cool. I got to go to the MAPS conference in 2013, so the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as an independent study. It was like I just wrote a paper about it, did a bunch of like lit reviews on different research topics. And so, yeah, I don't know. That experience with psilocybin really kind of pushed me into this realm of wanting to investigate the potential, because it was like I was suffering so much, and I was just so like surprised that I took this substance or this fungi, and it completely just helped me heal some of my trauma that I was going through. And so, you know, when I started on this journey, I didn't even think like psychedelic therapy could be maybe a few years away, with the way MAPS is helping with the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. I mean, it's looking pretty promising. I mean, we don't know if it will get there, but they're going through their clinical phase 3 trials soon, or they've already started it. And so this stuff could be available. Well, MDMA, depending on how you want to define that, some people might think that's not a psychedelic and more of an empathogen, but you know, it's almost here possibly, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. It seems like both Colorado and California are pushing for the legalization of psilocybin. I'm really hoping that happens because, you know, when we look at the data, magic mushrooms are like the safest psychedelic drug. And when you look at, you know, I mean, like people, you can't overdose on it. You throw up like your friend before you actually died from an overdose. And, you know, granted, there are, you know, incidents where people might, you know, perish because they're on magic mushrooms and operating heavy machinery, or maybe they're on some other, you know, drugs and there are, you know, contraindications, or they have health contraindications. But it is a pretty safe, substance to work with. I'm curious to know, what do you know of the work in Western psychotherapy on how mushrooms might be able to be used to treat different types of conditions, as well as MDMA?
Yeah, so this work kind of began really with Albert Hofmann in the West synthesizing LSD, which then they were using that in psychiatry in the late 40s, early 50s, through the 60s, through Europe, Canada. So, I mean, LSD was first being explored for psychotherapy, treating alcoholics. There's a lot of studies going on up in Canada. I believe it was near Saskatchewan, treating alcoholics with LSD. Grof's work was kind of like a wide range of applications. They were using it as, when they first discovered it, they thought of it more as quote unquote a psychomimetic, so this substance that mimics psychosis. And so they had this idea of, well, if this substance creates some sort of temporary psychosis, maybe we can understand the minds of our patients a little bit better as psychiatrists, psychologists. So they were actually like using it almost kind of like as a training thing a little bit back then too, to kind of understand these states of consciousness. And, you know, they were experimenting to see what the clinical application was. And Stan has some great stories of, you know, healing people with like depressive mood disorders and, you know, all through maybe schizophrenia, which is interesting. And, you know, that research it's there kind of in the past, but it's not like as hard science as, well, I guess the research was a little bit, how would I want to say this? Like, maybe a little bit lesser on the quality than what it is now. I mean, nowadays, like double-blind placebos and, you know, very strict guidelines. And so then after Gordon Watson brought back mushrooms from Maria Sabina from Oaxaca, Mexico, Hoffman synthesized psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in psilocybin mushrooms. And, you know, they were using that for various psychological disorders. And I think the one thing that caught on the most was with near-death anxiety. So a really famous study was down at Spring Grove in Maryland. It was with Walter Pankey, Bill Richards, and Stan Groff, and a few other folks. But they were using psilocybin as a way to help treat near-death anxiety due to like a terminal illness, which that really catches my attention because of like this whole near-death thing. And I think it's fascinating. So right now, John Hopkins, that was a huge study that they ended up doing with psilocybin, treating near-death anxiety. And then they've also done some stuff about spiritual, mystical experiences and similarities between psilocybin and mindfulness. UCLA was doing the psilocybin and near-death anxiety study as well, and then NYU came onto the scene, and they're doing that as well. And really interesting, they're working on psilocybin, and I believe it's alcoholic, or it might just be general for addiction. I think it's for drinking, alcoholics. So yeah, it's fascinating that this stuff is starting to come back and be researched again for various psychological disorders. And the main thing for MDMA is that they're helping to treat people with PTSD, resistant treatment PTSD, and they're having phenomenal results for what they're going through at the moment. So it's hard to really say that, you know, it's causal and this is what's treating it, because it's also adjunct to psychotherapy, and they're still not through their whole clinical phase 3 trials. So, but I mean, the preliminary results are looking pretty good so far.
What do you think it is about non-ordinary states of consciousness that can catalyze healing for people, especially those with PTSD, and, you know, for, you know, many people, including people that are healthy and don't have issues, actually trigger a desire to grow and evolve spiritually?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to go back to my framework with Stan Groff. That's most of my background, is working with breathwork, and Stan and his wife at the time, Christina Groff, developed this breathing technique called holotropic breathwork. And I ended up working with some teachers in Vermont that in the lineage of Stan, we've been calling it transpersonal breathwork. But really that this concept of when we access these states, Stan likes to say that there's this inner healing intelligence. And, you know, they also use that when talking about doing MDMA therapy or even some of the psilocybin therapy and research, that these when you access these quote unquote holotropic states of consciousness, this inner healer knows what to do. So I heard a really great analogy of, say, you get a cut, you go to the emergency room, you need to get stitches. The doctor is really just facilitating the healing process. The body knows how to heal itself. The stitches and the doctor are just creating a container for the body to naturally heal itself. So it's the same thing when we're in these states. Our body naturally knows what to process, knows what to bring up potentially. This is the theory behind it. I'm not saying that it's definite, but that once we're in that state, it can bring up the most, say, highly charged piece of emotional content or psychic content. So the one quote that I like about like psychedelics that Stan really, how he defines it, is that they're non-specific amplifiers of mental or psychic processes. So whatever's highly charged there in the body and in the mind, when you're in these states of consciousness, brings it to the surface to help to heal or get processed or recontextualized in another way. And it's hard to access that sometimes. I mean, you could do that through psychotherapy, but I mean, it could take, 10, 15, 20 years. This can kind of help get you there a little bit quicker, possibly.
Yeah, so I'd love to understand more about Stan Grof's work, especially around the breath work. So how is it that certain types of breathing techniques can help us expand our states of consciousness? And is there a difference between what can be achieved through holotropic breath work, for example, versus some other type of expanded state of consciousness that might be elicited by an entheogen?
Right. Well, what turned me on to the breath work was I had a pretty the first time I ever did it, it was a pretty profound experience of reliving some birth trauma stuff that I found out to be right. Like I felt like I was being suffocated, and I felt like the umbilical cord was wrapped around my neck. And I asked my mom about it, and she's like, "Yeah, it's really weird. You had the umbilical cord wrapped all around your body, and we thought you were going to die, or we thought you were going to have brain damage because it's just
wow."
Yeah. And so that was like, okay, that's interesting. But, it was just this really profound experience of reliving parts of my near experience. And, I went into this thing thinking, I don't believe this is going to work. But having an experience on par with some psychedelic experiences that I've had, that's what really kind of was like, whoa, this is a really powerful and, relatively safe technique. So, breath work has always been, or the word breath has always kind of been related to spirit and souls and life energy throughout various cultures. And the breath has always been connected to this like spiritual energy. And there's been various techniques. I mean, obviously the one well-known thing that maybe people are really familiar with is pranayama breath work. So most of those breathing techniques in Indian philosophy or yoga. And in the West, you had Wilhelm Reich, who was a student of Freud, use breath and the body to kind of go into the body, and he called this like armoring. And so we hold a lot of stuff in our emotional body, and the breath was a way to get in there. And so the breath has been incorporated into some sort of therapeutic modalities early on in psychotherapy with Wilhelm Reich, and then his student Alexander Lowen, who developed this technique called bioenergetics. And then another guy, Leonard Orr, who developed this breathing technique called rebirthing breathwork. The thing that I find fascinating about holotropic breathwork is Stan comes with his whole background of psychedelic research and 50 plus years of working with non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so I think what differs is that he brings this theoretical framework of working with birth traumas and transpersonal experiences, and has an idea of like the potential of experience that could happen, where some other breathworks may not have that. And it's pretty simple. It's just creating a container with loud music, with trained facilitators, and the process is just breathing as deeply and fully as possible with minimal pause in between the in and out breath. And with the music, eye shades, it's an internal process. So it's kind of almost modeled off of like the early psychedelic research, where you would wear headphones, listen to music, eye shades, and it's about this internal process. But the breath is the vehicle to get there, versus the substance. And so all this stuff is inside of you. We have these different vehicles, whether it's an entheogen, a psychedelic substance, or a breath, or breath. It's
In your experience with breathwork, is it possible to go as far as you can with an entheogen like mushrooms or ayahuasca?
It depends. This is an interesting question, because the first time I did it, I went back to that state where I saw those beings, and I went back to this kind of near-death world where I went on that first mushroom trip, and that's what blew me away. Where I was like, "Oh my God! You could get here just by breathing."
So you saw full-on 3D Technicolor other beings, entities communicating with you.
Yeah, like machine type world with these entities, and
wow,
I mean
that's fascinating.
That's what really kind of blew me out of the water, was like, how did that just happen?
Just on the breathing.
Yeah, if you want to get maybe shamanic, that when you ingest an entheogen, say ayahuasca or mushrooms or anything like that, I feel that sometimes there's like a spirit attached to that, and that's guiding you. Breath work, well, with any entheogen or psychedelic, you buy the ticket, take the ride. There's no getting off the ride, and until it kind of leaves your system. With breathwork, you can kind of slow it down. Maybe you won't go to these deep places if you're not ready to do it, because we always like to say it's breath work. It takes a lot of work to actually get there. But if you're ready to do that, I mean, it can have some profound effects. So it's tricky. To some extent, you could have these really powerful experiences that are on par with psychedelics. Are they similar? No, yes. I don't know. It's tricky because they're just totally different experiences.
Yeah, I had this interesting experience where I was at Burning Man, and then I ate a magic mushroom chocolate, and we were in our camp art vehicle, and all of a sudden somebody gets onto the vehicle, was like, "Hey guys, you're going to go to this workshop." And so, in kind of like a show of solidarity, we all kind of like filed out of the art vehicle and went to our, we had a dome conference space where we had, DJs and a party. But during the day we had all these, really interesting talks. And so a friend of mine led this breathwork workshop, essentially. And this was my very first experience of accessing expanded states of consciousness just through breathing. So, it was just following along the program, and I'd totally forgotten I'd eaten the mushrooms. And then I just found myself in this full-on other dimensional space, experience, like, traveling through space, spaceships, ancient Egyptian deities operating high-tech golden spaceships. I mean, it was like full on. And so then I realized, oh my God, I'm having this experience because I ate the mushrooms and I'm doing the breath work. So it was beautiful, beautiful experience and a surprise to have done the two. But I haven't personally yet had a purely breath-focused experience of other worlds. But I look forward to possibly experiencing that one day.
Yeah, my teacher, my teacher Lenny Gibson, he was not really convinced. And I guess, during a session, he said, wow, this is like on par with like a psychedelic experience. And he told that to Stan. And Stan said, yeah, that's what really turned me on to it as well. Like it was kind of on par with it. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I would love to understand. I believe you had mentioned earlier that Stan also identifies different states of expanded states of consciousness. So what would the different types of experiences be? How would he describe them?
Yeah, so I mean, there's various ways to describing these experiences, say psychedelic experiences. So, I mean, you could say exceptional human experience. That's something I've heard. Expanded states experiences. I think the common ones are altered state and non-ordinary states of consciousness. Stan's argument, or maybe not argument, but his he says that, altered state reminds him too much of veterinary medicine and being altered or neutered. And that also kind of implies that there's a right way of seeing, there's a right way to experience consciousness. Non-ordinary states is just kind of too vague to be talking about some of these other healing experience, because you could have a non-ordinary state of consciousness by having the flu, or trauma can induce that, or stress can induce that. So there's lots of other different factors that could produce a non-ordinary state. But Stan really likes that word holotropic. So holotropic meaning moving towards wholeness, the Greek word holos meaning whole, and then tropine in the direction or moving towards. So, just kind of classifying it that these states with, say, psychedelics or entheogens or breath work or any sort of healing modality has this intrinsic nature to move us towards a state of wholeness and healing. So it's not just this right or wrong way of seeing. It's not this just talking about these non-ordinary experiences that could be anything under the sun, but saying that these experiences have the potential for healing.
Given the advancement of scientific and therapeutic knowledge on the potential clinical applications of psychedelics towards the treatment of various kinds of conditions, for people that want to experience these things, so one of the questions that I often get is, I will share information about LSD or psilocybin mushrooms and how there's a potential for the therapeutic treatment of depression. And so, of course, since these studies are official academic studies and partnerships with, certain, educational institutions, unless you're actually part of that group, that test study group of people, there isn't a way that you can actually access a treatment, or is there? If somebody wanted to self-medicate with LSD to deal with their chronic depression, how to go about that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because these substances are still illegal. And that kind of goes back to that whole cognitive liberty argument of maybe we should have the right to be able to explore our minds and consciousness, and who has the right to really say that's not illegal. But, at the moment it's tricky because it is illegal. And, I think it, not suggesting it, but people have the right to make that decision whether or not they want to engage in that activity. If you want to do something legally, you could go to maps.org. They have a little tab that says participate, and I think they're accepting applications at the moment. I don't know, when this will be aired, or, if people are seeing this later on, but, they're accepting people with PTSD for MDMA assisted psychotherapy. You could apply to some of these institutions that are recruiting study participants. So, NYU is recruiting folks for the alcohol study with psilocybin, and so just kind of knowing what's out there and maybe knowing where to apply, and depending on your diagnoses, and that's kind of tricky because it only really separates people and says only this person with this diagnosis can get access, and that's definitely an argument of this new wave of psychedelic research, is that maybe these experiences are really healing. Are we just limiting it to people with mental health issues because we've kind of put it in this medical box? And who's getting access to it? So it's kind of like a weird, gray, tricky area. But right now, it seems like that's the way it needs to be done, because you need to get the research, the validation that these things have legitimacy. And but legally, you could go to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca. Amsterdam, the magic truffles are legal over there. And,
I find that really fascinating. How is it that the mushrooms are not legal, but the truffles are?
I have no idea, because I remember they used to be legal and then they banned them, and then I just don't understand because the truffles still contain psilocybin in it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
So one could self-medicate with truffles in Holland and then
mhm.
in tandem with the self-medication work with a psychotherapist that is somebody that might be like an integration specialist so that they could get the most out of their, kind of like hybrid supported and personal self-medicated treatment. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think being able to work with somebody is really important. So if you are thinking about doing that, so I mean, Joe and I are going down to Jamaica pretty soon. So mushrooms in Jamaica are legal, which is pretty interesting. So there's a retreat center down there called Myco Meditations. But I mean, yeah, well, yeah, I guess to talk about integration, the reality is that people are self-experimenting and doing this stuff to begin with, whether the law says it's illegal or not. Coming from that harm reduction integration realm, I think it is important to maybe speak to somebody to talk about your experience, to help them process that experience, because it can really amplify the benefits of it and also maybe reduce the harm. So, maybe talking about preparation, how are you going to prepare for this? What's your setting like? And then if you did have a really difficult experience or a bad trip, then you have somebody to work with to process some of that psychic material. So I think it is important to work with somebody, and whether or not you want to work with somebody that's licensed, I think that's important to figure out who you want to work with. Is that a licensed therapist, or do you want to just go the coaching route? And I think it's important to kind of, do your research and figure out who you could want to work with, because,
Yeah, I think that's really good advice because it may be that somebody who isn't a licensed psychotherapist still has the skills to be able to help you work with deep issues. So going back to the self-medication route, I would say absolutely, if you're going to find somebody to work with, it better be somebody who's not going to tell you that LSD is bad and you should stop. If you're going to use LSD to like work through your core issues and try to heal trauma, then you want to find somebody who's okay with it, like who gets it, who's not gonna shame you or make you feel afraid that it's a deadly drug and you should just you should be on Prozac instead. And then of course figuring out like what exactly it is that you need. So for me personally, I went through a period where I did I had a really traumatic experience that involved my business partner betraying me and then breaking into my house, and then I was scared and sleeping with a knife next to my bed like for like a couple weeks, and then I had to hire a private investigator because I didn't know what level of crazy he was, and discovered all kinds of things about him that made me think, oh my god, this person might actually be crazy, but he hid it from me so well. And so all of that was happening at a time where I had so much going on and some parental like family type of stuff coming up too, and it was really, really hard for me to process all of it, and most importantly the betrayal of somebody that I really trusted and worked closely with for like a year and a half was like fundamentally like it was so painful. So I made a conscious decision to simultaneously, to at the same time drink ayahuasca and work with a therapist to help me get through the issues, because something like that is going to raise up all your core issues, and when it feels the most raw, that's like the best time to like work through them and to heal them. And the person that I ended up choosing, I worked with that individual for, I'd say, maybe 6 to 8 months. And it was extensive. It was like, maybe, 2 to 4 hours a week. We had like, heavier weeks and like lighter weeks. And he wasn't a licensed psychotherapist. He had actually chosen not to get his license, though he had gone through training, but then ended up having his, coaching, he had coaching training and like NLP training. And so he worked with a very specific modality called timeline therapy that I found to be really effective for me. And so the conjunction of both the medicinal, the plant medicine healing track and the supported coaching and therapy really helped me work through all those deep emotions and feelings of betrayal and get down to like the core wound and to heal a lot of that core wound. And so by the time I was through that period, I felt like a totally different person. I felt so much more light. I felt like completely over like what this guy did. I mean, I actually genuinely cared. Like by the end of it, I just felt compassion and caring for this individual. Like, man, you know, I'm so sorry you went through that. So I discovered he was an addict. So, you know, that, you know, explained a lot. But yeah, so, you know, I just wanted to share that story because indeed, you know, if you know of somebody who is effective in their work, and even if they don't have a license, it doesn't necessarily mean they cannot help you. But I would say that if you are going to pursue the route of working with psychedelics, plant medicines, or entheogens to resolve some persistent issues around trauma or depression or you know, PTSD, then, you know, please consider doing so in tandem with therapeutic support, because you will get so much benefit out of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story. It's really powerful. Yeah, and I think, you know, something, you know, there's a lot of wonderful people that do coaching out there that have been through traditional training. I think, like, if you are working through something traumatic like that, it would be important to find somebody who has a background with trauma, that has worked maybe clinically in trauma, or just has, you know, a good background and understanding of it. And, you know, that also brings up the point of like this whole concept of self-experimentation, rites of passage that, you know, our culture, we just don't have the container to hold these things. And spiritual emergence. You know, it doesn't sound like that was a complete spiritual emergence crisis, but that can happen during these powerful experiences. And I think that's one thing that we may not always touch on. And I think it's really important to be honest about the risks and benefits of these substances, whether they're right for you. And thinking about like your mental health history. So, you know, what's your family history? Is there any like psychosis or any personality disorders or thing in your family? And just to be aware of that, and to, you know, because these experiences can really bring up a lot. And I think it's important to understand the risks and benefits if you are going to take that route of self-experimentation and kind of creating your own sort of rites of passage. But spiritual emergence is a real thing. And I don't know, I don't hear it talked about too much in the community. It's obviously getting brought up a little bit more now with like integration being a topic. But, you know, that's what really kind of got me on the path too, is that near-death experience was obviously a spiritual emergence crisis. But then, you know, during my self-experimentation time in my early 20s, I mean, that definitely catapulted me into a spiritual emergence crisis. And I had no idea what to do. I had no supports. I didn't know who to talk to. And for a lot of the time, I thought I was going insane. And, you know, that's kind of what also pointed me in the direction. I mean, finding Stan Grof's book really grounded me. I also was reading a lot of Ram Dass, and, you know, it was like these teachers were speaking through me through their literature, which was awesome. And then I found some great teachers to work with during my undergrad time, working with a shamanic practitioner and working with my breathwork teachers. But yeah, it's definitely a real thing of entering into these states and having your world kind of blown to pieces, and then just being like, now what? Like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, so can you help us understand, what do you mean by spiritual emergence, and how does one know if we are going through, how would we know if we're going through a spiritual emergence crisis?
Yeah, so you could say spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency. So spiritual emergence was, again, coined by Stan and Christina Grof, kind of like a play on words, that there's an emergency going on, but it's also an opportunity for consciousness to emerge at like a higher level of functioning and, you know, emerge through maybe some of this trauma that's coming up, or whatever the experience is. So, I mean, a spiritual emergence, there's, you know, I think 12 different categories, and it could be like, you know, near-death experience, which also could be like a shamanic initiation, shamanic illness. You could have a spiritual emergence through renewal of the soul, mediumship. You know, there's all sorts of different ways that this could come about. But really, it's kind of like a psycho-spiritual crisis of, you know, normal reality might not just be looking the same. And from a clinical glance, that could look like budding psychosis. And so it's also kind of really tricky to navigate. When it turns into emergency, that's when, you just can't function. Like, you need some sort of support system, maybe round the clock support. So I actually worked with people with early episode psychosis in a residential home, and those people were definitely, some might have identified as having a spiritual emergence, crises of like things started coming up. They didn't really know what was going on. But I mean, they were also in emergency where they needed support round the clock because they couldn't function. So that's when that is like, okay, you might need some sort of like higher level of care if you're not taking care of your basic needs. And, I was able to somehow navigate my emergence process just by doing grounding techniques. And I just always had this voice in the back of my head. It was like, everything's fine. You're going to work through it. So I never got to the point where like I needed to access a higher level of care. But I think that's important for people to know that sometimes that is an option and might be necessary.
Is there a place that people can go to if they're having some type of spiritual emergency, and that might be related to psychedelic use?
Not really.
So
yeah, it's a shame.
Friends that are willing to house you for a bit and and support you through it.
Yeah, there's some houses like there's one that's opening up. Well, they're doing like in-home service at the time, but the Gnosis Retreat Center based out of the Bay Area. A lot of these things are based around psychosis related things, but that could also be maybe psychosis induced from a substance that's prolonged for a few months. So I actually worked at a place in Vermont, and it only accepted Vermont residents, but our mission at the time was, if you did have a drug induced, say, quote unquote psychosis, it had to be at least 6 months or 6 weeks out. So, I mean, if you took like a substance like 6 weeks ago and you're still in this process, that you were able to come to the program. But yeah, there's not a lot of programs that like really house this framework of working with spiritual emergence or working with like plant medicines or psychedelic experiences. If you end up in that state, I mean, most people will end up just going to like their emergency room or going to see like their therapist, which then could also refer you to a higher level of care. So it's not a framework that's really integrated within the mental health system.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's good to know what our system can offer us and what it can't. So we're at the end of our session, and I would love to close our conversation by asking you what your thoughts are on cognitive liberty. What does it mean to you, and why is it something that we should, or ought to consider as a fundamental human right, or not?
Yeah. When I think of cognitive liberty, actually the first thing that pops in my head was when I was a kid, I used to spin around in circles really fast and just lay on the ground. And I was just like so fascinating by the world, just kind of moving. Just that freedom to be able to experiment with your consciousness and mind. So there's an organization for the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics, and that's where this term was kind of coined, but they define it as the right for each individual to think independently, autonomously, and to use full spectrum of his or her mind to engage in multiple modes of thought. And I think it's a fundamental freedom that, we're in this body. I think we should be able to be able to explore our body and our mind. And, obviously sometimes that gets out of hand and it interferes with things. If somebody is, running out in the street causing chaos, it might be a little too much. But, I think it is a basic human right to be able to explore who we are. I really like this quote by Socrates: "The unexamined life is not worth living." So, I mean, how do we develop a relationship with the universe around us? Sometimes that is through plant medicines or altering our consciousness. Working with these states of consciousness have always kind of been embedded in traditional cultures throughout the world. And, it just helps us better understand who we are as a person and who we are in this universe. So I think, yeah, we should have the right to really explore that. And, what really got me on this topic was having this near-death experience at 16. We don't know when these non-ordinary states are going to arise that can really catapult us into different ways of seeing the world. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's just a basic human right to be able to want to understand who you are and your relationship to the world. And there's different tools and techniques to get there. I mean, what else do you really know about the world besides your own experience, right?
Truly. And our capacity to explore the range of our consciousness experience is really vast. It is part of what it means to be human, and to have some type of institution like the government mandate what we can and cannot do to ourselves that allow us to explore our inner experience is very tricky. It's very it's scary. It's tricky. It's invasive, and what does it matter if you are actually many people go about their are nonviolent, and they might be in an expanded state of consciousness on a psychedelic substance, and totally high functioning individuals and productive individuals in society. And so why should that be a crime, and why should those people be put in jail for 20 years possibly?
Yeah, we did this interview with this guy, James Casey, who actually went through the MAPS Phase 2 studies with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and, a vet, and has PTSD. And one quote that really stuck out from our episode with him was that saying that he's, afraid that next phone call that he's going to get is from a vet friend that just killed himself, because there's a high suicide rate within that population. And that if they try to engage in, this therapy by themselves or outside of the research, that they could land themselves in jail just because they're trying to heal their own traumas. And yeah, you also brought up about like high functioning people as well. It's like, what about the people that have, they've done this type of stuff and had really great creative breakthroughs? I mean, Steve Jobs is pretty open about his LSD research. Carrie Mullis, who developed, I always forget what that is, the PCR, right? Something about like the DNA. I don't understand biology enough to really understand it. But, all these people with had these states of consciousness and were able to contribute to society in really great ways. And then there's that whole, like, I don't know if it's true or not, but Francis Crick, who developed, the DNA, in an off interview says that he, his experiences with LSD really helped him understand that.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that LSD can be very effective in nonlinear problem solving. And and so that there's a relationship between the LSD use of some of the most creative people that we know, whose creations have fundamentally changed civilization and made a mark on our society and culture.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kyle. I want to ask how the audience can best stay in touch with you.
Sure. Yeah. You can check out our website or our podcast. It's called psychedelicstoday.com. And we also have some online education. We have a course on, it's called Navigating Psychedelics, Lessons on Self-Care and Integration. That's up on our, we use Teachable for our online education. So it's psychedelicstoday.teachable.com. We have some courses up there that you can check out. But yeah, psychedelicstoday.com. You can find the contact form there. Send us an email if you want.
And you also had a free gift. You also had a free gift for the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah,
that is called 8 Common Mistakes of Psychedelics. So it's just really going over some harm reduction techniques and just some common things that come up if people are going to take this route of self-exploration and experimentation. So yeah, there's a free little webinar up there that we can give to you. And now that I'm thinking it off the top of my head, I'd also like to offer a little discount code for our Navigating Psychedelics course. And if you just use the code EntheoNation, you'll get a nice little discount from that.
Let's do Entheo, Entheo.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the code that I use across the board. So easy for people to remember. And yeah, so Entheo. And thank you so much for the discount. I really appreciate it. And I want to wish you a beautiful rest of your day, Kyle. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.